thank you for inviting me to talk to the SIGN group, which obviously is probably the world's premier social identity group. So I feel very privileged to be asked to give a presentation here. Can you all see my share screen? Yeah, okay. Right, so yeah, hi, I'm Martin Edwards, and from the business school, obviously. And it's good to connect with the School of Psych. I think vast majority of people in this group are in the School of Psych. And I'm going to talk about multifocal identification.
Sorry, interrupt, Martin. I think you got the screen in a way that we can see all of your notes and the next slide. I don't know how to change that. I think you have to.
All right, I'll have another go.
You might just want to know. That's all why I thought to
Yeah,
mention.
I don't think there's any notes in there, but anyway, I'll have another go. It's always the way, isn't it? With Zoom. Right, let's see if this works.
It's still the same, but that's fine.
I'll try.
The wrong monitor, Martin.
Does that work?
No. Still the presenter view, Martin.
All right.
Can I also remind everyone to mute?
Right. I think that's it. Is that it?
Yep. Great.
Okay. Got there in the end. Sorry about that. You'd think I'd be able to do this having taught hybrid mode for many months. Okay. Yeah. So I'm going to look at talk about multifocal identification and withdrawal cognitions in a merger context. Now, mergers impact employees. They have a massive impact on employees, and a failure of merger is often blamed on the failure to integrate two or more workforces. And one of the key issues and problems with integration are the massive problems of assimilating and accommodating two or more groups of people with considerably different identities, often different loyalties, values, cultural norms in their organizations, and the way of doing things. A key outcome often with mergers and acquisitions is that people leave. And you often see the press and people talking about the post-merger and acquisition exodus. So a failure of post-merger integration, a key indicator of failure, is that lots of people have left. So the focus that I'm going to focus on here today is on withdrawal after an acquisition. And a lot of the kind of experts and consultants in trying to deal with and help manage organizations deal with this exodus are trying, they present kind of explanations and models on how you can try and keep people after after a merger. So how to retain employees after a merger is a key concern of organizations that, if you like, business is very concerned about in a merger and acquisition. Now, mergers aren't necessarily something that we tend to experience that much in academia. There has, however, been a recent discussion of the University of Adelaide and University of South Australia merging, and that failed, that didn't go through. And recently it came out in the last week or so, an investigation into why that failed. Apparently they were arguing over the name of the organization and who was going to lead it. So both of those topics there are really key for the SIGN group, obviously experts in leadership and identity leadership, but also the issue of identity of the organization. You can imagine the executives in the organization arguing over whether they were going to call it the University of South Australia Adelaide or the University of Adelaide South Australia. And obviously this identity issue was clearly key with this proposed merger. It may be back on the books now, though, with the new VC, who apparently is a big merger advocate, apparently, according to the press. So he's now taken over the University of Adelaide. So we may see an interesting merger about to come forward in a university context in Australia. Now, the research and literature on mergers and acquisitions, there's a huge literature focusing on social identity issues many of the people in this room have done, or in this virtual room anyway, not the physical room, not in my room, it's just me in this room, in the virtual room, have done lots of research in social identity issues over the years. Now, obviously, Deborah Terry was doing research in mergers and change back in the late 90s. When I was still an undergrad, she was publishing research on mergers and acquisitions. But Matthew Hornsey has written on issues to do with bringing together two groups and has discussed issues with mergers and acquisitions with Mike Hogg and Terry in their review of social identity theory in organizations. They focused quite a bit on mergers and acquisitions back in 2000. Pretty much all of the social identity organizational researchers have looked at merger and acquisitions at some point, including Yolanda, for example, has done research on it. And so I'm not going to go through and cite all the papers that and all the researchers that people have been focusing on mergers and acquisitions. I like the phrase that Albert et al. Raised with change and mergers, that often there's a loss of organizational moorings with mergers, where people's mooring with their previous organization, their bond with their previous organization is often at threat. There's a potential loss of that mooring. And I really like that phrase, and the idea of a boat floating around, having lost its mooring in a rough sea, just kind of conjured up in my head there. So I thought I'd put that image there. Identity threat, however, is absolutely key in mergers and acquisitions. There's a threat of discontinuity of identity loss, a potential loss of people's social identity and their links with their organization, potentially threats of being assimilated into a greater collective. There are status challenges where people and their organization may have a status threat. Another organization that is merged with has higher status. There are threats of distinctiveness in terms of identity and being dominated by another organization. There's issues and threats of entitativity, where the nature of the organization and its identity that people are linking with becomes blurred and is not clear. And so all of these things potentially create a situation of organizational of identity threat. So we can kind of assume that a merger is a ripe context to look at identity threat and consider identity threat. And Van Dijk uses Van Dijk et al. Used the phrase "working under a black cloud." So I thought I'd put that image there. A nice black cloud going through a merger. There's uncertainty. There's threat of this identity threat, and working under a black cloud. And that's rain, by the way. I thought I'd put some rain there. There are big well-being issues associated with this identity threat, though, and there are many people in the room, world experts, that raise the importance of identification, and how identification is really important for well-being. So we can assume that associated with mergers, there's also a challenge to well-being and employees' well-being. Interestingly, in the merger and acquisition social identity research, the research have tended quite often to focus on post-merger identification and whether or not people identify with the post-merger organization as a proxy often for successful integration. Because the assumption being, if you identify with the merged entity after a merger, then you have successfully integrated. However, focusing on post-merger identification, we can, if we do that as researchers, we can lose this issue around, well, what causes people to leave? So the key thing I'm focusing on here is whether people want to leave or not over time. Also, I'm going to focus on multifoci issues. Now, the essence of social identity theory allows for multiple possible social identities that we link ourselves with. And in an organizational context, there are many possible aspects, nested identities that we can link ourselves with in the workplace. Very few merger and acquisition studies consider this multifoci complexity issue and how this complexity of multiple foci and our bonds with multiple entities can become quite important. Now, I've just put a little caveat here. I'm focusing on the merger literature specifically, but there's also a restructure literature that also raises issues and can deal with issues around mergers and as well. So, for example, if UQ decided to merge the School of Psychology with the business school to become a faculty, wouldn't that be an interesting idea? There would clearly be similar issues around mergers with that restructure, but it's really a restructure. So I'm just putting that caveat there because there's also a whole literature on restructures and change that actually is also can still deal with the similar issues that we get with organizational level mergers. Where multifoci issues are considered in mergers and acquisition research, it's often people are focusing on whether people identify with their pre-merger organization and their post-merger organization, and maybe whether people identify with the organization, the merged organization, and another subunit, perhaps. You very rarely get any research. So by a subunit, I mean whether they identify with their division or perhaps their team. You very rarely get research in the merger and acquisition area that focuses on multiple possible entities and identification through the process. An interesting question, though, is can identification with multiple identities and different levels of the organization or different entities impact how important other forms of identification may be in how employees respond to the merger process? Can, for example, if I identify with my work group and my department very highly, can that help buffer the impact of this potential organizational identity threat and challenge that I might be experiencing through the merger? Or may I have other identifications or other loyalties, if you like, and bonds with other entities that could hinder whether or not I respond positively or negatively to higher or lower levels of organizational identification? For example, if I identify highly with my profession as an academic, might that lead me to a greater likelihood to want to jump ship if my organization is talking about a merger? So there's a possibility of some antagonism across some of these identity targets, if you like. But the key question I'm looking at here is, might other alternative identification forms impact how important organizational identification is, where organizational identification, as I've mentioned, is often seen as a kind of proxy of successful organizational merger and acquisition integration. Now, if you look at the research at employee responses to merger and acquisition, the vast majority of it is cross-sectional work. And even if you go back to Hogg and Terry's paper in 2000, that they argued that mergers take time and move through stages during which social identity processes may operate. They raised the issue that very little research at that point was longitudinal. That's still the case. There are still, there's a fair amount of research, and some people in the room have done this work, where people are looking at, they go into an organization post-merger or maybe pre-merger, and they ask retrospective or prospective measures around how people feel and their identification levels with different parts of the organization, maybe pre and post merger, but very little research tracks people through time, pre-merger and post-merger. And there's also a complication that on the surface, the measures of identification are not always what they seem. So, for example, pre-merger identification can sometimes be anticipated identification. So I may be a researcher and I may ask people before the merger happens, do you identify with this organizational entity that is about to come into place? But similarly, you can often get pre-merger identification measures in research that are actually taken post-merger. So say 2 months after a merger has happened, a researcher may ask, how much do you identify with your pre-merger organization? And that's actually a post-merger measure of a pre-merger level of identification. So a lot of the research has some of these interesting challenges when you go for them to try and identify where the measures are, when were they taken. Very few papers have pre-merger identification measures with pre-merger entities and post-merger outcomes. Literally, you can count the number of those organizations, the number of research papers that have looked at the merger context in that way on one hand. Okay, And one exception is the Lipponen et al. Paper, and obviously Yolanda's on that paper. But very few papers do this. And almost no studies take pre-merger identification measures, regardless of what foci they're looking at, and track how people respond with turnover behavior and intent following a merger. Almost no papers do that. And that's really interesting, given how important in the merger and acquisition narrative in the professional scene, the whole issue of people leaving after a merger is. So, as I say, much of the research focuses on post-merger identification as a proxy of successful integration. And that's interesting. And one of the reasons why that is because there's a challenge with the researching into mergers, and that's often people have left after a merger. And you can't really get many measures of how people feel if they've left the organization if you are researching in the organization. So that raises a real issue with doing research, trying to access this issue of post-merger exodus, if you like, because often people have left and you can't actually access that data. So that's a real challenge doing research in this area. And similarly, you can't get measures and access people's perceptions on their levels of identification or their quit intent if they've already left the organization. So that's a challenge with the merger research, obviously. Now, so there are a number of key questions still to be fully answered in this research area, one of which is, are high levels of pre-merger identification a good thing or a bad thing if you want to avoid a post-merger exodus? That question still hasn't really been answered in the literature in a straightforward way. And also, there are also questions around, well, what about multifocal identification? Can we look at some of the complexity of people's multiple identity linkages in a merger context? And so some of that complexity is not being teased out at all in a merger research, which is, I plan to do some of that now. So the research context that we're working with here, this is a big merger in Finland, where the merger of social services and healthcare were brought together. Previous 11 divisions across those two organizations were merged into 6 new divisions. There are approximately 15,000 employees affected by this merger, almost a 50-50 split in terms of the size of these organizations coming together. And the aims were to establish efficient, fluent care pathways, customer patient-oriented unified services. And we tracked, and so this research with Jukka Lipponen and Jana, they tracked people's identification of their profession, their organization, and their work group, their team, over a 2-year period, from a 2-month period before the merger, and then subsequent 2 waves following this, 10 months after the merger, and then another 22 months after the merger. So the employees were tracked over a 2-year period. So the main research questions I'm focusing on here are: 1, do levels of pre-merger identification across different foci impact long-term withdrawal cognitions, or an increase or decrease in the likelihood of people leaving? So the exodus, if you like, the exodus problem. And 2, so a second research question, so I'm trying to fit a lot in here. Does the workforce vary in its multifocal identification, configuration, or orientation in terms of identity salience, the subjective importance of different foci in individuals? Do people vary in that across the organization? Do they vary in change in that over the merger period? And are these linked to patterns of withdrawal cognitions? And with these 2 kind of slightly related but different research questions, I'm going to take 2 different analytic approaches. So the first research question, where I'm asking, do levels of pre-merger identification across different foci impact long-term withdrawal cognitions after the merger? So that's the first research question I'm going to talk about here. So we look at whether pre-merger professional identification is related to post-merger withdrawal cognitions, pre-merger organizational identification is related to post-merger withdrawal cognitions and also pre-merger work group identification. So the key question is it the case that if I identify strongly with my profession, I'm more likely to want to leave or less likely to want to leave the organization after the merger has happened? So that's a really interesting question. And what would people assume? So I'm going to just ask people to assume, do you assume that, or would you assume that if you have high levels of professional identification before a merger, after the merger, you may have higher or lower levels of withdrawal cognition? So what would that relationship look like? Anyone shout out? Anyone say what they think might happen there? Let's see if this works. Yolanda, what do you think?
Lower.
Lower. So if you have high levels of professional identification, we have lower levels of post-merger withdrawal cognitions. Is that what you think? Yeah. And what's your rationale for that?
Well, it could be the other way around.
Yeah.
I think you can argue it both ways.
Yeah. So the key issue is you can argue it both ways, and there could be arguments both ways. So as I said earlier, if you identify with your profession, you might be more likely to leave the organization and go to another organization in your profession through a merger. But similarly with organizational identification, you've got similar issues. If you really identify strongly with your organization, might the trauma of going through a merger mean that you're going to be more likely to leave? Now, obviously, the answer is likely to be, it depends. And as academics, we'll probably, we would want to say that because there are lots of possible features which might intervene to potentially dictate whether or not the levels of pre-merger professional, organizational and work group identification will lead to higher or lower levels of withdrawal cognitions. Now, if we take into account pre-merger withdrawal cognitions, we can then look at an increase or decrease in withdrawal cognitions or desire to leave the organization over time. And that may make things a little bit more interesting in terms of, okay, we might have time one level, pre-merger levels of withdrawal cognitions or whether people want to leave, but that might increase over time. People might be more likely to join the exodus, if you like. Now, so we're here looking at the delta of withdrawal cognitions, the change in withdrawal cognitions. Now, of course, I've mentioned bluntly that the main effects of whether or not we'd expect a relationship between pre-merger organizational, professional and work group identification and post-merger withdrawal cognitions. But we can also look at the interplay across those multifoci features in terms of identification. And that's what this first piece of analysis is going to do. We look at whether or not how important organizational identification pre-merger is at predicting a change in withdrawal cognitions from time one before the merger to after the merger. And we look to see whether or not levels of work group identification and professional identification might interact with organizational identification. They'll interact to determine potentially how important organizational identification might be pre-merger at being related to a change in an increase or decrease in withdrawal cognitions over time. So we have obviously a three-way interaction here is what we're looking at. Now, if we just look at the correlations, we can answer some of those kind of main effect questions which I was asking. Now, so here we have, this is the row looking at withdrawal cognitions at time one. And as we can see, there's a negative relationship with organizational identification pre-merger, professional identification pre-merger, work group identification pre-merger, and withdrawal cognitions pre-merger. And that also flows through for withdrawal cognitions post-merger as well. So Yolanda was right in saying that you'd expect a negative relationship with professional identification and withdrawal cognitions going forward past the merger. Interestingly, when we look at those identification forms and their relationship with withdrawal cognitions, which I'll do some more in a moment, we find that the more you identify with the organization before the merger, the less likely you are to show an increase in withdrawal cognitions over time. And that's the same with professional identification. The more you identify with your profession, the less likely you are to show an increase over time. However, your work group identification doesn't quite reach significance here. It's in a similar direction, but it doesn't quite reach significance here. So that's quite interesting there in terms of how important the work group identification is as a main effect, predicting an increase or decrease in pre-merger to post-merger identification. So here we have the structural results. Now, what have we got here? Okay, when we put all three forms of identification in predicting time 2 withdrawal cognitions, we see that organizational identification before the merger predicts withdrawal cognitions after the merger in a negative direction. And similarly with professional identification, and the work group falls away in terms of whether it shares a relationship with withdrawal cognitions at time 2. And clearly what's quite interesting there is that professional identification and organizational identification are clearly quite key there, predicting withdrawal cognitions at time 2. When we take into account time 1 withdrawal cognitions, however, and look at the change in or increase or decrease in withdrawal cognitions before and after the merger, we see that the main effect that we find is that organizational identification before the merger, the more we identify with the merger before the organization before the merger, the less likely you are to show an increase over time, the less likely you are to join the exodus, if you like, going over time. However, that relationship is qualified by high or low levels of work group and professional identification. We have a three-way interaction here. Now, obviously, describing a three-way interaction, just looking at coefficients becomes quite difficult and complex. So here we have the graph that helps explain what's going on with that three-way interaction. Now, because it's a three-way interaction, it's quite complex. So I'm just going to talk through some aspects of the figure here. On the y-axis, we have an increase of withdrawal cognitions going above the 0, going up, and a decrease in withdrawal cognitions going down below the 0. On the x-axis, we have low to high levels of organizational identification. So the people on the left, if you like, had low levels of pre-merger organization. The people on the right had higher levels of pre-merger organizational identification. And then we have the three conditions. The three lines here represent three conditions, four different conditions of low work group identification, low professional identification, or high work group identification, low professional identification, low work group identification, high professional identification, and high work group identification and high professional identification. I'm just going to pull out two of these lines just to contrast two of them. We have the downward sloping dotted line, which shows quite a strong negative relationship between pre-merger organizational identification and an increase in withdrawal cognitions over time. So clearly in that condition, that downward sloping dotted line, which is, by the way, the low work group condition where you have very few bonds with your local work group, but you have a high professional identification. That condition is highly sensitive to pre-merger levels of identification with the organization. Okay? So that particular condition seems to have the higher level of sensitivity in terms of organizational identification, be really important if you don't have any local bonds, but you identify with your profession. So as people have high levels of organizational identification in that particular condition, then they have lower increase in withdrawal cognitions over time. If they have lower levels of organizational identification, they have higher levels of increase in withdrawal cognitions pre and post the merger. Okay, so that's, if you like, low organizational identification, low work group identification, but high professional identification is the, if you like, the optimal exodus condition. Okay, so that's quite interesting. If you contrast that condition with the high work group identification and high professional identification condition, we see that organizational identification before the merger has very little impact. So you could argue that if you have high work group identification and high professional identification, potentially whether you identify with the organization before the merger is much less important in terms of whether you're likely to show an increase or decrease in withdrawal cognitions over time. You could argue that that's a kind of buffering condition in terms of it buffers the impact of high or low levels of organizational identification. So that's, if you like, the research question 1. We have high pre-merger organizational identification. It generally will help with the post-merger exodus, but it's conditional on team level and professional level identification. Without a local team level identification, those who are high on professional identification are particularly sensitive to variation in pre-merger organizational identification. Having a high team level identification and bond and a high professional link potentially negates the buffer, the impact of pre-merger organizational identification. So that's a key finding associated with that first research question. And then the second research question, I'm interested in whether people vary in terms of multifoci configuration and how there is change over time in that configuration in terms of whether people have higher levels of subjective importance in their profession, organizational, or work group identification, and how are these linked to withdrawal cognitions. Now, what I've done here is plot a latent growth curve on these 4 constructs. Okay. Now, the grey line at the top is professional identification. The orange line is work group identification. The blue line is organizational identification, and the yellow line is withdrawal cognition. We clearly see in this organization overall, in this sample overall, people have very high levels of professional identification. Next down is work group identification, and clearly the organizational identification is much lower in terms of subjective importance on aggregate in this sample over time, and we can see a clear reduction in that organizational identification pre and post merger, and we can see a slight increase as well in the withdrawal cognitions over time linked to that. All of these levels of identification on aggregate go down significantly over time. Okay, so that's a downward slope over time, and the withdrawal cognition is therefore also going up significantly over time. So that's the organization as a whole on aggregate. And these are the coefficients associated with those latent slopes. Now, so far I've been talking very much in a kind of variable-centered manner where I'm looking at relationships between variables, time 1 to time 2, looking at maybe interactions of those relationships over time. Okay. One of the interesting questions, obviously, in a context like this is that people will differ. There will be heterogeneity in how people respond, both in terms of their levels of salience or subjective importance in their multifoci profiles, but also how they change over time. So heterogeneity is really key. And so the next question I'm asking is, okay, can we take a person-centered approach to try to identify whether there are differences in, if you like, within our sample of how people tend to respond over time, rather than looking at aggregate relationships over time. And I'm taking a person-centered approach here, which is associated with latent class analysis, latent profile analysis in longitudinal form, latent class growth analysis, and growth mixture model. Person-centered analysis is well-suited analysis when you have multiple phenomena that you're trying to look at over time in tandem. So nobody has tended to use person-centered analysis in the merger and acquisition. There's in the vast majority of cases been variable-centered, just looking at relationship. Now, obviously, with growth features over time, the latent profile which I presented there was an average level of growth over time from a starting point, an intercept, and over time. But obviously, there's variance in our data set, in our sample, and people differ. The question is, can we identify particular patterns of how people are responding over time? So we had previously, I was presenting 4 different latent growth slopes. And now with person-centered analysis, we can look at, can we identify classes, profiles across those growth trajectories over time in those key factors. So this is just an aggregate, 4 different slopes over time. And with growth mixture modeling, I can see whether or not we can find profiles of that, different groups over time, and what that might tell us some interesting information. And I get straight to the results, okay? We find 6 profiles, 6 different identifiable profiles in this data set. in terms of how people respond over time. 3 of those are positive, and 3 of those I'm considering negative. The reason why I'm presenting them positive profiles is the top 3, the dominant cognition is never withdrawal cognitions. It's always higher levels of identification is always the dominant cognition across those 3 profiles. The bottom 3 profiles, at some point, withdrawal cognition is a dominant cognition. People are the bottom 3 are the exodus conditions, if you like, the exodus profiles. Now, just to kind of talk a little bit more about those different profiles, if you look at the top 3 profiles, you'll see that in every instance in those top 3 profiles, you either have high levels of professional identification and low and high levels of work group identification. And regardless of what happens with organizational identification, which is the blue condition, there's always high levels of professional and work group identification. So regardless of what happens with organization identification, that's always the case. And coinciding with that, withdrawal cognitions is never the dominant cognition. Okay? Down below, however, we have a alienated flight risk group, if you like, I call it, where basically they have very little identification across any of these foci, very high withdrawal cognitions throughout the whole process. These people have constantly been thinking about leaving. Okay? The next 2 negative profiles, however, are quite interesting because one of them has high levels of work group identification, but not high levels of professional or organizational identification, and the dominant cognition is withdrawal cognitions over time. The last group has high levels of professional identification, but not work group and not organizational identification, and the dominant cognition going through time is withdrawal cognitions as well. So that, in some ways, this supports the previous analysis that we looked at, where if you have high professional and high work group, whatever else happens with your organizational identification, then withdrawal cognitions may not be your dominant cognition. So you're less likely to join the exodus, if you like. One other thing that's quite interesting the good news from these profiles is the majority of survivors here are positive in their adaptation. Something like 85% are in positive groups. Professional team identification can mitigate the loss of the organizational moorings. The bad news is that clear evidence that groups show considerable instance of growing identity threat and loss of moorings. There's a really unhappy group, and some people are getting more unhappy as they're going through in terms of their identity links with potential groups. So if I just go back to that, there are some groups here where people are clearly going through a decline over time. Okay. And another key finding from this is that the levels of emphasis of identification orientation, they do change over time in terms of some of these professional identifications change over time, but at no point does the configuration switch from cosmopolitan to local or vice versa. In other words, from professional to the work group identification, or work group identification, at no point does it switch from work group to professional identification on aggregate over time. And that's interesting, and that kind of shows us that this orientation, whether you are more distal oriented or cosmopolitan, as some people refer to it, or local oriented, no point does that switch over time, which supports the idea that the subjective importance of identities across different foci is fairly stable over time. Key point in terms of these 2 analytic approaches, the person-centered approaches and variable-centered approaches are very different. They give very different insights. You can look at a similar issue over time, but they can also provide different avenues into answering a similar research question. So I'll stop there because I've talked long enough, and if anyone has any questions, then now's the time to do it.